Welcome to Sergeant Dorsey Speaks. I'm a retired 20-year veteran sergeant of the Los Angeles Police Department, and I am not afraid to pull the covers back, expose that thin blue line, and talk to you honestly and candidly about police training, police policy, and a whole lot about police culture.
Join me in giving a wonderful welcome to Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey.
Good afternoon. I started this journey because I saw a need. In 2013, there was an incident that happened in Los Angeles, and while I don't condone what happened, be clear, I don't condone what happened, but I understood how the officer got there, and it was a black police officer by the name of Christopher Dorner. And some of you may or may not know the story, but he was an LAPD officer who was fired. He was sent through an administrative process. He thought it was unfair. He had written a manifesto and complained about a lot of things that he had experienced on the job. And when he lost his job, and because our administrative hearings are much like a kangaroo court, there are no rules. They make them up as they go. He appealed it and he was unsuccessful. And so the people that he thought were at fault or had a part to play in his termination, he went after. And he had targeted these people and followed these people for years. It took 5 years for them to, between the time that he was terminated and the time that he did this awful thing that he did. And the first person that he went after was the daughter of an LAPD captain. He found her and her fiance and he shot them both. He fled and was headed to the house of another LAPD captain who was the chairman on his administrative board. En route to this officer's house, he saw LAPD because they were surveilling this officer and providing protection. I'm imagining, I don't know Christopher Dorner. I had been long retired by the time this incident happened, but I would imagine that he was probably a little paranoid because he knew what he had done. And so he immediately started to flee in his vehicle after seeing these LAPD officers in another city, not in LA. So he knew that they were there providing protection. And in leaving that location, he encountered two officers from another neighboring police department, probably freaking out, thought they were there looking for him. They weren't. They were stopped at a red light, and he shot and killed them. He eventually was found in a cabin in San Bernardino, California, and it took a few hours before SWAT converged on the cabin, and he was ultimately killed. So I don't condone what Christopher Dorner did, but in his manifesto, he talked about a lot of things that I could relate to because everything that he had complained about I knew to be true because I had gone through all of that, but I went through it 15 years before him. And so I decided to sit down and write my autobiography, and I wrote my autobiography actually while they were pursuing him. I finished my book in 8 days because it was very cathartic. I just needed to get some stuff out of my system about how I had been treated by my coworkers, by my supervisors. And so I also wanted, more importantly, I wanted police officers who find themselves similarly situated, who feel like they have been done a disservice or they weren't treated properly, or really anyone else in a workplace, back to the whole going postal, who feels like your grievances are not being properly addressed. I wanted police officers to know that there was another way, that you have options, because I had gone through everything Christopher Dorner went through, and I survived. I made it to the finish line. I didn't kill anybody. I also wanted, perhaps if his mother ever got word of my autobiography, she might pick it up and it might help her understand why her son would do this thing that he did, because unless you're in law enforcement, you don't know, you don't understand the nuances that go on behind the scenes, and I thought maybe it might bring her some comfort, because as a mother myself, having raised 4 sons, I couldn't imagine what it was like for her to watch the news and hear them talk about her child in a way that was foreign to her, because I'm sure she thought I didn't raise him this way. And so I thought it might be helpful if she understood what a police officer goes through and how someone could be pushed to do a thing that's unthinkable. And again, this is not unique to law enforcement. It's not even unique to adults. We hear stories of kids being bullied at school, and I saw something very recently, very sad. 10-year-old kid hung himself because he was teased relentlessly by his friends. I guess he was born with some kind of a condition and he had to wear a colostomy bag, and these kids teased him to the point where he hung himself. And I don't know how a 10-year-old even knows to do that. I think about when I was 10, and I don't know how you even figure that out, how you even know that that's an option as a 10-year-old. And so I just think it's very important that we have conversations with our young people on a variety of levels about bullying and about what it is when you feel like you're not being properly respected, because for the kids, respect is a big thing. I've got millennials at home, and I get that. I get that when I talk to people about interactions with the police and why I think it's so important for you to comply. And I drive activists crazy when I say comply, because the response is always, I know my rights, and I don't have to, and whatever, whatever. And my response is, yes, you know your rights, I get that. But I want you to live through the encounter. Just like there's angst in the community about police encounters, we have that same angst about going home. And so I just realized that I was very perfectly situated, if you will, to talk about it from both sides, because I'm a mother, I'm a black woman, and I've been a police officer. And I was a police officer in uniform for 20 years, and I did it at a time when there was a lot going on in LA. I worked under the police chief commands of Darrell Francis Gates, Willie Williams, and Bernard Parks. Those were the police chiefs that I worked under. So I know that it's possible to be in a rough and tumble area, do police work, be aggressive, be proactive, take bad guys to jail. And you can do that and allow them to have their dignity. I treated people the way I would want anyone to treat any of my 4 sons if they stopped them. So I was never ambivalent about what it was that I should do when I encounter someone. And I talk about my own preconceived notions, if you will, about police work when I joined. And I really only joined the LAPD because I needed a good job. I was a young mom. I had just gone through a divorce, and I had a small child, and I was having a good time at DOJ, but wasn't making enough money. And so I started going through the process to see which police department could I get through first, and I was going to lateral back to DOJ as a special agent. And because of the consent decree that LAPD was under, and they were expediting the hiring process, they picked me up first. And I was very fortunate, and I'm blessed to say that next year I will be retired as long as I was a police officer. I will celebrate on August 25th of 2020 years of retirement. And so that's not something that, you know, a lot of people get to say, particularly in law enforcement, because statistics show the longer you do that job, the less you have on the other end. And it was my mindset when I came on, understanding I could do 20 years, retire on a service pension, and then have another life to live. And so some of my contemporaries who I left behind 20 years ago are just now starting to retire with 30 plus years. And my hope and prayer is that they have longevity in their retirement and are able to enjoy the fruits of their labor. But, you know, I understood that all of the trials and the tribulations that I went through on the LAPD, and while there were some bad times, they weren't all bad. I had great assignments. I had great partners. But I now know that the reason I went through all of that was so that I could come before you and speak credibly about what it is to be a police officer. And so I started doing this in 2014. I wrote my book in 2013. And then in 2014, the first incident that started making national news that we started hearing on a regular basis, because now it seems very cyclical and we hear it regularly about police officers engaging communities in a way that winds up in a deadly use of force. And I'm talking about Eric Garner in New York. And right after Eric Garner was Mike Brown in Ferguson. And then Tamir Rice and John Crawford, who was shopping in a Walmart, picked up some kind of a BB gun or something, and officers were called. And so I'm seeing all of this stuff happen, and I'm seeing family members in front of a bank of cameras with a reporter's mic in their face asking them, what do you want to do? What should happen? What do you want to say to the police? And I just saw folks that were hurting. I just saw parents who, they don't know what they want to say to the police. They just know they don't want another family to go through what they're going through. And so as I'm watching them struggle to say, I knew what I thought police should be doing. And so I began speaking out in a way that was very different from what others were hearing, and thus it led to the many calls that I got to appear on CNN to speak about deadly use of force. And what I know is that the majority of the officers are doing the right thing. Most police officers join the police department for the right reasons, and there's just a small percentage, like everything else, that gets the attention, just like on the news. If it bleeds, it leads, right? So we see this small percentage of police officers who are engaged in activity that's tarnishing the badge, and because I spent a significant amount of my adult life on the LAPD, I wanted to speak out about that and hopefully say some things that might cause some police chiefs around the nation to maybe do things differently. One of the things that I have a lot of angst about with police departments is that I understand that self-reporting is not sexy and it's not something that police officers do, particularly men. I don't know what it is about you guys that you don't like to let folks know when you need help, but it's a thing. And suicide rates are very high among police officers. And I think it's those kinds of things that we get involved in, that we see day to day, that can cause us to maybe act out in a way that's inappropriate. And I think that if police departments were to have psychological evaluations regularly, and I just say maybe every 2 years, that might be helpful. I know when I was working vice on LAPD, our policy was you could only stay there for 18 months. And the reason that you can only work vice for 18 months is because of the things that you see, because of the things you're involved in, and because it's gnarly, and they didn't want to twist you up too much. So you do 18 months and then you're out of there. Well, if you're in patrol, if you're a ground pounder like I was, and you're a street cop, you see crazy stuff day in and day out. I remember so vividly calls right now that have stuck with me, and I like to think I'm pretty grounded. I like to think I'm okay, but the fact that I'm even going to mention some of this to you lets you know, to some extent, it still bothers me. I remember as a young officer, one of my first calls, a young man that got shot in the stomach. And I pulled up with my partner, and you know, I'm a rookie and I'm wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, and there's this guy who's been shot in the stomach, and he's sitting on the curb and he's talking to us about this shooting, and we're trying to find out who did it and where are they now. And as he's talking to us, he's holding his intestines in his hands. I responded to a radio call some years later as a sergeant of a young man who was threatening suicide, and he was on a top of a building, and we had spent about 30 minutes talking to this kid, trying to get him to come down. And my officer that had been talking to him, I thought he had gotten through to this guy, and this kid looked left and he looked right, and I thought he was looking for the ladder that led up to the side of the building. And then he backed up, and I thought he was headed to the ladder, and he backed up and he just ran with all his might and jumped. And he lived. He lived. And I think about that, and I think about how it affected me, and I thought about, as a supervisor, how it affected my officers. I thought about that young man. I had a son his age at that time, and the sound of bones crushing when he hit, and watching him as he lived through that. And I thought, wow, I think we need to talk to somebody about this when we get back to the station. And so I did. I went to my lieutenant, the watch commander, and I said, hey, can we get some psychologists here from BSS and have them be available? And my lieutenant thought it was a good idea, and we did that. And as my officers started coming back to the station, I was letting them know that BSS is here if anybody wants to have a word. And my officers were, no, Sarge, we're good. We're good. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to let it be known that it bothered them, because we understand as a police officer, you know, sometimes if you say too much, it can cause you jeopardy. And if your gun is taken away from you, that's always a concern, because how can you be a police officer if you can't carry a weapon? And so officers just hold stuff in. And I think that's why the suicide rate is what it is. Just last week, a young woman on the Chicago Police Department was found dead in her personal vehicle. They say it's a self-inflicted gun wound. Several officers in September of last year on that same police department, Chicago, committed suicide. And so I get that, you know, officers won't self-report, particularly male officers. They won't self-report. And so I think it's important for police departments to, like private companies do, have an employee assistant program where you kind of compel folks. And if you're not going to compel them, then you need to sit down and just crack open an officer's head every now and again and just make sure everything is running around right. And if it's not, then let's help them. And if we can't help them, if we can't get them where they need to be, if they don't have the skill set necessary to be the police, then off to Pizza Hut you go, or Domino's, or Sparklets, or Lowe's, or whatever. Because listen, I understand that everybody that wants to be the police shouldn't. There's some things that bother me, and so I wouldn't do well in an ER room. And if I was working in a 5-star restaurant and I was making meals that were just amazing to look at night after night, aesthetically amazing, and everybody was going home sick, they'd get me out that kitchen, right? You wouldn't let me come back night after night just making folks sick. And so if you understand that police officers sometimes don't have the skill set necessary to do that job, then I think the onus is on the police department. And listen, if a police chief won't admit that there's a problem, then there's nothing to fix. And so rather than preach to the choir, because you guys know these things go on, let's talk about ways to fix it. And I think part of the way to fix it is, and this drives millennials and activists particularly crazy, I say get on the police department, join it. Because change is going to come from the inside. I had an opportunity as a young black woman working with male whites who like to sit folks on the curb, because that was a thing in the 80s. You stop somebody and you set them on the curb, and it's very offensive. It's offensive to the person, and it was offensive to me as a black woman to have someone try to set someone on the curb under the guise of, it makes me feel safe. So my suggestion to my partners was, let's handcuff them like we're trained and taught, and let's put them in the back of the car so that they're safe and we're safe. We conduct our business, and then we take the cuffs off if we have a reason to, and we send them on their way. You don't get to make those kind of decisions if you're not on a department. So I encourage people to join police departments. I also encourage community engagement, because oftentimes, at least in LA, and I'm sure this is no different, whenever there's a new police chief, they always have community meetings, and they usually have them in several places at different times so that it's available for people to come out and meet with the people that want to work in your community. I suggest that you get involved and get engaged. And then on those rare occasions where you're stopped by an officer who's a little heavy-handed or a little mouthy, because listen, police officers don't start off killing you. They start off talking to you in a way that's disrespectful. And they start off being a little aggressive with you, uses of force that aren't really necessary. And if a good partner, I think, would have someone with them who's doing that, would say, hey, let me Let me deal with this person if you see him getting aggressive. Let me talk to him if you see there's a personality conflict. And why guys won't do that, I don't know. I don't understand you people. I think, girls rock. And if there were more of us, it would be a much safer place. Because, listen, I understand as a female officer that I've got limitations. I get it. There's not a guy in here I can beat up, right? And so I've got to, if I want to get you into my car, I mean, I could fight you. I would. I'll bite you, I'll do whatever I have to do, but I'd much rather just get compliance. I'd much rather just bat my eyes if that's what I have to do, or I'll threaten to get on my radio and call 6 big bruisers that are going to come over and we're going to book you at the hospital instead of the jail. So really, I need you to just comply with me. I understand that, but there's something about guys and testosterone, and when somebody doesn't turn around or when somebody doesn't come here, it becomes a test of wills, if you will. I call it contempt of cop, where an officer, gets mad, and I understand it, I get it. We have great power and great deference is given to what we say. And so I understand when you tell someone to come here, we expect them to do that. And when they don't, sometimes it becomes a matter of, then I'm going to punish you. It's not always about taking someone into custody. It's not always about compliance. It's about, you made me mad. And when you piss a cop off, there's a price to pay. Let's be real. There's a price to pay. And sometimes that price can be, I'll just give you a ticket, and I'm going to sentence you to traffic court. And you're going to be mad, and you're going to threaten to bring me, and I'm going to love it because I'm going to be getting paid overtime. Or you could piss me off on a Friday, and I could arrest you for something that I absolutely know I don't have sufficient evidence to prove, and it's going to be a district attorney reject. And you're going to go to court on Monday, and the DA is going to say, not enough here for this particular crime, let them go. But guess what? You just spent 72 hours in jail. I just took 72 hours out of your life you can never get back. And it looks good on paper. I had probable cause, reasonable suspicion, whatever police code talk they want to use to put you in jail, knowing that you made me mad. Cost you some money because I'm going to impound your car. I could park it, but why would I do that? Because you pissed me off. So I'm going to impound your car and whatever else I decide to do. And so listen, this stuff happens, and it's okay to admit that it happens. It's okay. What do we do to fix it? If you've got an officer out there who is being testy with people because they have a situation, they have an anger management issue, because police departments don't have employee assistance programs that help identify those kind of situations, or when it does happen, they sweep it under the rug, right? You guys heard that. They make it go away because, there's city liability, and police chiefs understand city liability, right? When you see them talking about a officer-involved shooting or a use of force that occurred, they always use what I call, police code talk. When they talk about, reasonable suspicion and probable cause and investigative stops, and to an untrained ear, what does that mean? What's suspicious? What's suspicious about a person on any particular time? If I right now, start skipping around this room, you guys might find that suspicious. That could be off-putting to some of you, and so it's very subjective. And we understand that, and police chiefs understand that, and they understand that liability follows, and they understand that at the end of the day, all of you taxpayers are going to pay that $6.4 million that's going to go to the family because it was an unnecessary use of deadly force. So what I say to that is, if officers were held responsible, if there was accountability, that's what family members who have victims, who are victims of deadly police force, if officers are held accountable, I think some of this stuff would stop. Officers are trained to use force, deadly force, as a last resort after you've done everything else, not as a first resort, which is what we see a lot of. Contrast that with the good work that officers do. We don't get to see that. We don't get to hear that because that's not sexy. That doesn't boost ratings, if you will. That's not something that they want to talk about and show on the news for 3 or 4 days, but a good killing, we'll see and hear that for a whole week, right? And so what I want to do is I want to encourage all of you to share some of what you hear today about what goes on and why it goes on, and tell your young people, like I tell mine, when the police stop you, comply, because sometimes police officers are responding based on information that they received via dispatch, and the time that we stop you is not really the time to explain. I'm not going to explain to you when I stop you. I'll tell you when I'm done. But if our young people are not complying with police officers, we know bad things happen. And that too is not unique to just black folks. Bad things will happen. No one is immune. And so there are some examples of that that I wanted to share with you, because I've had, when I started speaking out, you know, I didn't know when I started speaking out that people would actually see me on TV and find me. I didn't know that was a thing. It was really, I mean, I expected pushback and I expected, you know, to hear something, but I didn't expect folks to really aggressively look for me. I mean, I've never watched TV and seen someone on TV say a thing and then figure out how to find them and tell them what I think about it. But I've had some people reach out to me, and there's one young man who reached out to me. Don't know his name, but I do know the name of his friend, and it was important for him to reach out to me because his buddy, his name is Cameron Reedus, and Cameron is a white kid. I think he was about 19 years old at the time when he was shot and killed by a police officer on a university campus. And I think what happened is that he had been drinking, and university police stopped him and contempt of cop because Cameron was drunk. And there was an altercation, and eventually the officer shot and killed him. They shot and killed him, and the family sued. And the city did what a lot of cities do, is they throw buckets of money at the families, and they change nothing. And so I'd like to see that change. I'd like to see, it would be nice if sometimes, and obviously I'm not behind the scenes, so I don't know what kind of counsel these families get, but it would be nice to see if the families, rather than, you know, ask for buckets of money, and I get that you want redress and you want something to be done if you lost a loved one, but wouldn't it be nice if the police department actually changed policy? Wouldn't it be nice if the police department actually held those officers accountable for the foolishness that they do? Because what I believe to be true is that when it makes national news, when we see an officer engage in activity that looks to me like it violates policy and maybe in some cases law, it's generally not the first time, because remember, police don't start off killing folks. When Michael Schlager shot Walter Scott in the back 8 times, and he said that he had taken his taser, we saw on video that that wasn't true, but what we now know is that that was the third time Michael Schlager had been involved in such an incident. That was the third time that he had tased someone. Wouldn't it have been nice if that police department had dealt with him the very first time? Wouldn't it have been nice if the police department had dealt with him the second time? Because Walter Scott might be here. And so there's no harm in admitting that everybody who wants to be the police shouldn't be. Everybody doesn't have the right skill set. And so that's why I speak the way that I do, and I'm sure that I probably drive some of my brothers and sisters in blue crazy, because I talk truthfully about what should and should not happen. You don't get to shoot somebody in the back because they run. I've had people run from me. I got 2 choices. I can get some exercise, or I can let them go. I don't take it personal. I'm not personally offended. It's not a personal affront to me if someone doesn't come here, because what I know to be true is that you live here and I work here, and I'll see you tomorrow or I'll see you next week, and then we'll have that conversation, because I'm not chasing you. I'm not a runner. But that's not what happens, because there's no accountability. And so I know that there's some police personnel here. There were some here this morning, and for those that are in a position of power, for supervisors, it's our responsibility to make sure that our officers are doing the right thing. It's our responsibility to be out there responding to those hotshot calls, responding to those pursuit calls, uses of force, and being there. And if there's already 5 or 6 officers and 3 more are coming to try to get a foot or a kick in, be the one that stands up and says, that's enough. That's enough. We're here to enforce the law. We're not here to punish folks. And if you identify an officer who doesn't have the skill set to do this job, help them if you can. And then if not, then let's get them to a job that's better suited for what it is that they do. And I don't see any harm in that. So anyway, I started off talking about Zachary Hammond and Dylan Noble and Cameron Rudis and Samantha Ramsey and Bryce Masters, Kelly Thomas in Anaheim, California, all young white kids who lost their lives, or in the case of Bryce, he was tasered and now suffers from brain damage. So none of us are immune, and so it's important for us as big people to tell the little people that when the police stop you, to comply and complain. Can you go ahead and start that video clip for me?
Now, race and justice in America. Tonight we look at efforts in Oakland, California to address bias where it exists in law enforcement. Special correspondent Jackie Judd has the story.
The racial turmoil in the U.S., stemming from encounters between police and black men, strikes a chord with Jennifer Eberhardt. The social psychologist at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, has spent her career exploring racial bias and how that plays out in the criminal justice system. Still, it came as a shock to her how embedded biases can be, biases we're not even aware of.
I'm on the airplane with my son, and he looks up and he sees a black man, and he says, "Hey, that guy looks like Daddy." And I look at the guy, he doesn't look anything like my husband, and I notice he's the only black guy on the plane. And he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "But why would you say that?" And he looked at me and he said, "I don't know why I said that." And so we're living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next.
Eberhardt has moved from the research lab to the streets of Oakland, 35 miles north of Palo Alto and a world away, to help a troubled police department change its ways. Like Ferguson, Cleveland, and Staten Island, the Oakland Police Department has an uneasy relationship with the minority community it serves.
There's times when I'm walking down the street and I'm accosted.
He didn't even ask me for my name. First thing he said, "Are you on probation or parole?"
Only 28% of the population here is black, but the majority of police stops, searches, and arrests involves black residents. In 2009, an unarmed black man, Oscar Grant, was shot dead at the Fruitvale BART station. Even though a transit officer killed Grant, long simmering resentment towards city officers erupted.
This area is known as the Fruitvale area of Oakland.
Rashida Grenage became a community organizer after a confrontation in her home 21 years ago, which led to the deaths of her husband, who was black, their son, and a police officer.
Good morning, this is Rashida.
Today, while Grenage says there are some fine officers and progressive commanders in the department, she believes 2 systems of justice prevail, one for wealthy whites in the hills around Oakland and another for minority residents in the flatlands.
There is an intuition that officers have about what they can do under which circumstances. Depending on what neighborhood they're in, depending on what they believe to be the socioeconomic profile and the resources of that person or that person's family.
And the police department would probably say because that's where most crime takes place.
But we're basing assumptions on the group someone belongs to, and that is racial or ethnic profiling.
Back in 2003, the Oakland Police Department agreed to implement court-ordered reforms that grew out of the case in which several officers were accused of framing criminal suspects. To this day, leaders are still struggling to improve relations between the police and the public.
Assistant Chief Paul Figueroa, tasked with finding ways to eliminate racial bias as the court ordered, is teamed with Jennifer Eberhardt to help change the entrenched culture.
Those are the questions that I get asked quite a bit in various meetings. Well, what's it like in East Oakland compared to West Oakland?
One of the big things that I focused on is this, what I call the Race Crime Association or the Black Crime Association. So it's not surprising, really, you know, that people might associate blackness with crime, but it can come up in surprising ways, or it can influence us in ways that we don't always recognize or know about.
And that so-called implicit bias is what Eberhardt is sharing with department supervisors. Among the many studies of bias that she's conducted, one in particular brought a startling discovery. Study participants were shown pictures of black and white men, all in very rapid-fire succession. Then they were shown fuzzy images of weapons, which slowly became clear.
The black faces facilitated the detection of the crime objects, whereas the white faces inhibited the detection of those very same crime objects. So for those objects, just being exposed really quickly to these black male faces led them to need less information or fewer frames before they could pick out what those objects were.
The gun.
Yeah, right, exactly. So they needed fewer frames before they said, oh, that's a gun or that's a knife.
The stereotype of blacks as hostile, dangerous, and criminal is one of the strongest stereotypes in American society.
It's not always easy for department supervisors to hear what Eberhardt has to say, but they listen and then try to sensitize officers.
You're not alone in this, right? You're not the only one sitting in the classroom thinking, wow, is that me? You know, you could see the looks on everyone's face that they're going, oh, okay.
What kind of pushback do you get from officers when you're asking them to do things having to do with racial sensitivity?
Oftentimes, some of the pushback is well, are we being called a racist? Is this, you know, what's all the accusations coming at us when we're working as hard as we can to bring about safety to the community? And that's part of the conversation.
On that agenda is to look at the multiple stop data.
Eberhardt and a team of student researchers also are in the midst of analyzing stop data and, importantly, body cam videos from Oakland police to determine what happens in that crucial and sometimes fraught moment between officer and citizen.
So you can look at things like pitch. You can look at the rate at which people are speaking, and you can look at loudness, and those things can tell you a lot about, you know, whether things are heated, whether things are going to escalate.
Sure.
You know.
It is the power of videos that brought tragedies like those in Cleveland and Staten Island to public attention. Eberhardt hopes the videos she is examining become tools that lead to better policing.
I feel like we're in a moment now where things can really shift. We're in a position to actually know, to really understand and to know what happens in these interactions, and, you know, why it is that sometimes they go awry.
I really think Jennifer's research is going to help us identify what issues are there and design some strategies to help us intervene in some circumstances, and in others question our programs and policies that are leading to some of these outcomes.
Assistant Chief Figueroa acknowledges it will take years to transform the department. Promises have been made before. Lieutenant LaRon Armstrong, who leads his own racial sensitivity sessions, knows the department has a lot of convincing to do.
We're as close as we've ever been to finally coming in to compliance with all the requirements of the negotiated settlement agreement.
Does the community feel it?
I don't know if the community feels it, because when you look at the climate in the community currently, it doesn't seem that way.
I think people are feeling vulnerable in different ways on both sides. I mean, you have community members who feel vulnerable around the police, and then there's vulnerability on the police side where when something happens in Ferguson or anywhere in the country, police departments all over the nation feel it.
You're supposed to be feeling safe because the police are there, but it's like whenever I do see them, it's like I don't feel as safe. It's kind of like irony.
This is Jackie Judd in Oakland, California for the NewsHour.
So we know that this stuff goes on. We've got stats and studies and surveys to support all of that, and I'm going to bring on my colleague who will talk a little bit more about that to further support and corroborate these things that we know to already be true. But what I will say to those of you who are out there, and to my law enforcement family here is that, you know, we ask the public, if you see something, to say something. If you see an officer who's struggling, if you know a family member who's in law enforcement and they seem to be exhibiting behaviors that might be indicative of something going on, either at home or at work, say something. And to police chiefs or supervisors or people in positions of authority, create safe zones for those officers who are working with those errant officers, that 1%, that small minority that are tarnishing the badge because they're out there being aggressive with people, using deadly force as a first resort rather than a last resort. Create an opportunity for officers to report misconduct, because while there is a term, whistleblower protection, there's no such thing for real. Particularly if you're a police officer, because I understand, and I know this firsthand, that, you know, when you report misconduct, there's a price to pay internally as well. I reported a supervisor who was sexually harassing me, and I went to the safe zone to report it, and it was like 2 miles from where I worked, and before I could even get back to my division, they already knew. And so that's why police officers don't report, because I have people ask me all the time, why don't the good officers tell on the bad officers? Because you don't want to be retaliated against. Because you don't want to be out there having somebody, if I could say it like this, handing your ass to you in a fight and have backup not come. So if police chiefs, I believe, wanted police officers to report those errant officers, they would create a real safe zone